Thanks, Margaret. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Anderson to present the next keynote. Peter teaches and researches in the area of organisational leadership, First Nation people's education, and teacher and academic professional development at the Faculty of Education at Monash. He works in the areas of pre-service teacher education, argues for a rights-based approach to the provision of education services to Indigenous peoples, underpinned by the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Peter sits on a number of advisory boards, most notably as the inaugural chair of the Australian Indigenous Lecturers Initial Teacher Education Association. This association advises the Australian Council of Deans of Education, an incredibly important association, the Australian Government and various regulatory bodies on matters related to Indigenous education in Australia. Peter was just telling me he's also the editor of the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Research Journal and has just been elected to the executive of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. So, Peter, it's a thrill to be able to invite you up to give this presentation, and we're very much looking forward to it. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. And I'd just like to firstly thank the Association for inviting me to come and speak to you today on something that I'm really very passionate about. It's something that sort of drives me constantly in terms of what I do every day. But I think a lot, as I'm speaking today, some of the stories for many of you are the same stories that we've been constantly talking about as Indigenous people, but also people who are involved in this space. And so I'm going to cover some of those points. But firstly, Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders past and present on whose land we meet today. I'd also particularly like to pay my respect and, well, deep respect to my other Indigenous colleagues who are sitting here in the room today. The amount of resilience that you have in the work that you do in these Western institutions is really keeps me going. We are a collective, and particularly at the end of the year, I know that we're very tired. There are things like institutional racism that we have to deal with, unfortunately still today, and I certainly take my hats off to you. So I guess, who am I? And why am I guess, why is it that I'm standing here? So firstly, I'm a Warlpiri man from the Central Desert on my father's side, and I'm also Murrumpatha from Wadia and the Daly River area in the Northern Territory. So polar worlds apart, two different cultures, one from the desert and one from the wetlands. And then also living on the Bunurong land in Frankston. And so the work that I do there as well sort of traverses many different nations and cultures. I'd also like to preface my talk initially with a quote from somebody who I, also stand on the shoulders of, is Professor Jeannie Herbert, in terms of my positioning as an Aboriginal person. So the issue of having a voice, in education is a vital concern for many Indigenous Australian staff and students in our learning institutions. This reflects the reality that for the past 220 years of educational history in this country, we have been denied a voice. Also, while I speak of the Australian experience, I know from my participation in various international Indigenous education forums that this issue of voice is a challenge for Indigenous peoples around the world. From an Indigenous perspective, the critical issue would appear to be the degree to which one is given a voice and agency. Having one's voice heeded is a real measure of who is valued within the society. Having said that, as a very small number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic staff in this country, I'm but only one voice. I cannot actually purport to be able to speak for everybody. What we find in the academy is that we look for that one solution or that one person to actually solve that problem. I can only speak from my experience and what's working in my research, in my little corner, I guess, of Melbourne. Having said that, because we are such a small group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, we actually do know each other, so we do share, which is really good. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there that, you know, I am but only one voice here. And there are many, many people much more qualified and been in this space much longer than I, and sitting in this room today. And so I particularly pay my respects to you. Because I know for some of you, some of the work that you've done, I would not be at university. As I said, a lot of these conversations have been going on for a very long time. So I thought I'd just go through a bit of contextualisation. And I'm playing in terms of my own teasing out, I guess, and how I'm making sense of this space of Indigenous education, which is a bit different to Indigenous studies. We tend to have these conversations around the post-colonial and the decolonised. I would actually sort of like to step back a little bit to say we're actually still in the post-imperial phase. I mean, we're just negotiating now in Victoria a treaty. And, you know, so we're still actually in that phase. So I can't say we're truly post-colonial, and a lot of the literature would say that. So I can't actually make sense of it as such from a theoretical perspective. And if I was to use Connell's Southern theory, that's how I sort of make sense of that in terms of how am I bringing the voice of Indigenous peoples and researchers into academia, okay? And I really think it has to be, well, for my own work, I think about it as the post-imperial space prior to being the post-colonial. And I think that the decolonised is going to be a conversation, I think, when we finally get to a point where we become a republic. Okay, so I think there's all of these different conversations, particularly around, you know, and this is how I sort of am trying to tease it out. So universities in this country are often touted and marketed as institutions for the greater good by many of Australia's leading thinkers. Like most of Australia's public services, the university sector is certainly not immune to the government whims of the day, something that we as Indigenous staff members or Indigenous teachers or anyone teaching in that Indigenous space all too well knows that, you know, if you first come the nurses, then the doctor, then the teachers, when the government comes in and changes, you know, their policies and things. So we have to be a bit quick on our feet, I think, in terms of how we engage in this space. Particularly that, you know, these institutions that we have here in Australia, I have a bit of a difficulty in terms of trying to reconcile my space as an Aboriginal person in the academy. I first started working in the academy when I started to see, you know, after many years of being administration staff and then doing a whole lot of things on the other side of university, and then crossing over, I guess, into the dark side of academia. But then thinking about this thing of what I saw, and this is sort of a bit of a story of how I got onto the trajectory of a PhD, is to actually start thinking about, we have this positive ghettoisation almost of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff in universities. So they're in the Central Indigenous Unit and they're doing teach-in. They're in Indigenous studies areas. They're in, I'm currently doing a project on STEM, starkly absent in the sort of STEM areas. And I'll show you some stats later on. So I started thinking about what is the value of the university? Like, what is the internal, organisational value? And everyone sort of says it's academic freedom. And so I went off and I'd done a whole lot of research around this. What is academic freedom to Australian academics at all levels of their careers, from PhDs right through to sort of professors and vice chancellors. At that time, one of the strange things was that my PhD research wasn't Indigenous enough to actually be awarded a scholarship. So it's sort of one of those things of being put in the cage, I guess. So I started talking about what is academic freedom and what does it mean? Now, funnily enough, our Indigenous staff members didn't actually have the luxury to actually think about that in terms of the findings. They were actually worried about getting students in, building student numbers, making sure that they're reporting, etc. So we didn't really have a conversation around academic freedom as such, which is a fundamental organisational value that everybody sort of understands at different levels of their career. And it sort of expands and contracts, I guess, as you go up the sort of ladder, and the faculty's telling that you have to do, you need this outcome over here, or you need to bring in some extra money over here. And so there's all of these contentious conversations to be had around it. But one thing that, in the data that I got, that always came back was that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not able to have those conversations as such, which is really quite interesting. And if we look at it, I think from an organisational perspective, we're getting people in, but we're not changing our internal organisational memory of what is this thing that is the university in Australia. Considering that, as I said, I get quite nervous, or sometimes I beat myself up a little bit, in terms of working in an institution that actively theorised that I was subhuman, that actively developed policies, beginning with Lachlan Macquarie, New South Wales, which was the beginning of the, if you look into it, did a bit of a policy ethnography, it's the start of the assimilation policy. Okay, there's specific clauses that said Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were to be taken from their parents and put into institutions. So it's one of those spaces that I think for many of us working, we have to sort of reconcile within ourselves what we're doing in terms of this space. So in terms of more sort of contextualising the field, and particularly drawing on the work of Linda Smith, one of the ways in which the underlying code of imperialism and colonialism is both regulated and realised. It is realised in the myriad of representations and ideological constructions to the other, in scholarly and popular works, and in principles which help to select and recontextualise those constructions. In such things as the media, official histories, and school curricula. We all know as educators that it's really important that children can actually see themselves in resources, etc. What's actually really, to this day, something that I'm working with in my teacher education course, is how are non-Indigenous teachers actually engaging in the multiple identities that we have as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's not just, urban, rural, remote. I mean, I show students the sort of multicoloured map of Australia with the Indigenous languages. And we talk about, a lesson that you might do with grade ones, that it's much like, looking at Europe as such. Each different language has a different culture. But what we find in resources and research here, as such, around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that we're just homogenous. And then we get into these quite nasty conversations that we don't have agency over as Aboriginal people as to, who is a real Aborigine. You actually speak English really well, Peter. I would like to go to placement where the real Aborigines are. These are some things that actually happened this year. So these things that I'm talking about are actually still happening. And how are we actually creating change, I think, is one of the main things around curriculum. So, one of the things that I talk about with my student, Christine Nichols, has written a great paper on, Jukupa. And what is it? We have it on the curriculum, the dreaming. But if you actually unpack that with students, what does it actually mean? I could possibly say other major religions are the dreaming as well. Because this is my history's lifeways and my country and my songlines relegated to something that's not real. It's quite nuanced in terms of how we're engaging, I think, at that curriculum level. It takes a little bit more planning, I think, but how are we building the skills of teachers around this in our institutions? Okay, so I think it's sort of moving up the chain, I guess, a little bit. Given that we've had, sort of since the post-Dawkins era in Australia, all of these shifts as we sort of engaging in a commodified education sort of space, and there's more policy coming out. And so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a policy initiative are put in. I'm guilty of being a policy writer in a former life. So that was just, one of the things that you just play around with. But, they're always there as such. But how are you actually making somebody belong in terms of that? How do you actually have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholar who just may want to be a maths researcher? I'm happy to define myself as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person of this country, a First Nations person, a Warlpiri Murrumpatha person. But sometimes the academy actually then tells me what I have to be. You are the Indigenous person, therefore you are teaching in this space. But do not upset the students. You can cut out boomerangs and colour them in for NAIDOC week. We might snatch and grab an elder for, and down in St Kilda come in and, do an incursion. But heaven forbid you actually unpack the word whiteness in your classroom. Heaven forbid that you have a critical conversation about race. For those of us who are working in the academy, we then become the angry person. The angry Ando, who's coming along and telling people to actually interrogate their own privilege. we're still being told that we're misconstruing what racism actually is in 2016. Disempowerment by people who are supposedly world experts in their spaces, very intelligent, extremely intelligent, lovely people. Comes something Indigenous, I don't know what happens. It's like there's no HEX debt, there's no PhD, there's no research grants, there's no experience. They just go to water. I don't know what to do. It really is, it baffles me. and I haven't got the answer for that, so if somebody has the answer for that, I'm sure if you could share it, it'd be great. So what does it actually look like in terms of staff numbers? This is from the Department of Education, the federal department just pulled off yesterday. We only have nationally 360 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic staff members engaged in research and teaching nationwide. Inclusive of non-academic staff members, we have 1,072 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff in our institutions. Now, one of the things that's I think about is if we're actually talking about, these policy and program initiatives around indigenising the curriculum, you can't indigenise the curriculum without Indigenous staff. Impossible. I also am lucky enough to sit on the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium, and this is one of the major concerns, is mentoring young academic staff members into academic leadership roles to be able to undertake this. I know in my own discipline of education, there's probably about 26 of us, with less than 10 employed by faculties and schools of education. It's a bit of an issue, but it's one that we're trying to work through the Council of Deans of Education as a priority area. It's difficult for teacher education because I think one of the the average PhD sort of time is 8 years, thereabouts, part-time if they're working and sort of coming in. And for many Indigenous staff members, I know we're working in Victoria, is that they're sort of mid-band teaching sort of in schools, so why would you actually want to leave that and come and be in a culturally unsafe space where you're spoken about and spoken to, but not spoken with? How would you put a level A student, a PhD student or a sessional student, staff member, into that space when you're actually trying to grow somebody to be an academic, to have resilience? This is something that our other students don't have to deal with. We have to, as an academic staff member, I have to actually build their cultural resilience in the institution. They've already sometimes come from a school. I've had my qualifications questioned. Are you really a teacher? Can you really teach my child? Are you qualified? Can you speak English? These are things that still happen in our profession. We have the highest enrolment rate in the sector for Indigenous students coming into teacher education, but the highest attrition rate in the profession. Again, it comes down to resilience and the extra sorts of things that you have to do. So one of the things that I would say to you if you're a dean or head of school sitting here today is, how can you actually work with your school and university to actually build your workforce? You know, how can you identify somebody around your university to work with and, you know, mentor in to become an academic? To actually be building the cognate area, of Indigenous education. Almost, I think of it as sort of like as method, curriculum and pedagogy, which is different to the sort of Indigenous studies, which is the studies about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think one of the things when we were talking with the deans was that it's around the craft of teaching, but we've got very few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people actually creating the knowledge that is Indigenous knowledge in teacher education. For those who are in the academy, in teacher education spaces, I think I'm fairly lucky because I get a bit of time off to do research, but more times than not, they're constantly teaching, and then the metrics come up, so they haven't published, or they haven't brought any money in, then they're at the hands of the spreadsheet. So there has to be some sort of checks and balances, I think, in that space. And it's actually not asking for special treatment. It's actually a right that we have as a sovereign person here in an institution that's actively disempowered us as such. And if we want to build that knowledge collegially, this is what we should be doing. So where to from here? As I said, we have such a small number of staff who are Indigenous, who are engaged in academic work, that we actually need people to work with. So it's not only those who have been minoritised or deprivileged who can speak about oppression. Those in positions of power and privilege also have an obligation to speak about these issues. And this is the challenge that I throw out, is how can you do this? We tend to think of this space as the big picture. It actually begins with the self and your sphere of influence. It's a fractal conversation. What do you actually have in your sphere that you can actually control and influence? Okay. So, I think in terms of trying to get your head into the space, I guess, of how you can actually do something or how you can be engaged, is to have an understanding of the international rights mechanisms. Many of us in Teacher Ed, we already look at this one. Oh, hang on. Okay. It had to happen. So we look at the Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. This is sort of something that we all cover in first year, I know, in my courses. But one of the more interesting ones is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Australia is a signatory to this document. There's going to be a new position paper coming out from Universities of Australia, and they also, are using this as part of influencing how the Vice-Chancellors will engage in this space as well. It's also used by the World Indigenous Higher Education Consortium as one of the international mechanisms that provide a place marker in terms of policy and practice, I think, for First Nations peoples. And there's also one around the International Labour Organisation Convention, ILO 169, that actually talks about the role of education and First Nations peoples and work and actually engaging in an economy. So these are some interesting sorts of levers, I think, that we can get people, sort of thinking about it on an international level. And I think that because we're always in such a state of flux when it comes to education, as I said earlier, we have, a change of government, then something else is going to change in teacher education or health. I keep coming back to the thing with this, that if we're practicing or being informed in our practice by these instruments, I think the sort of centre change at the policy level, federally and domestically, can go on. But if we're teaching to an international human rights level, we're teaching well, or we're engaging well in this space, whether it be, teaching or research in this space as well. Okay. So one of the most important ones that I sort of find that I keep coming back to in terms of my practice and thinking about this, and also I get my students to look at it in terms of when they're planning as such, which is Article 14. There's a lot of other ones as well that relate, but I think this is one that sort of guides my practice in this space. That Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their education systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. I guess we know from experience in the Northern Territory that's sort of been changed there. But Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination. I think this is really an interesting point that I cover with teacher education students, is that this then comes back to their planning and curriculum resources. Okay, the HPE area, it's always the mad, the bad and the sad of, Indigenous disadvantage, alcoholism, etc., etc. So you get the same narrative that's coming along. How are we actually digging a little bit deeper, okay, to changing that narrative? So a question, I could ask you is, how do you know what you know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, lifeways and cultures? Would you think you'd get fairly credible resources, mainly mass media? Okay. These are some of the questions we ask students, is how we're actually, sort of teaching for depth and changing that colonial narrative that is so ingrained, I think, in our organisations, just as part of organisational memory. Okay, people may not, be conscious of it. It's just the way it's always been done, as such. And then 3, we have states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language, again. There's a bit of an issue, I think, when we start talking about this thing about culture, teaching culture. I can only teach my own culture, so I would have to go back to the Northern Territory, into Yundamu, into the desert, and teach in my own language. That is teaching culture. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples don't want teachers to be able to be teaching the culture. Please teach about it. it's the nuance. You're not teaching culture. Or when we say language, I get lots of students coming to me and they're saying, oh, I'm going to teach a lesson in, the Woiwurrung language, and we're going to learn this and that, which is, and they've got an app in Melbourne, so a Melbourne language. And I sort of say to them, well, would you actually want to learn French from somebody who is not a native speaker, and that you have no idea on how the pronunciation works or the syntax, all of those sorts of things. So I think sometimes it's a bit of changing how we're sort of thinking about it. And I think as a practitioner, if we can start to work out, that fine line between Indigenous studies and Indigenous culture, and by no means always just saying, well, I'm going to get somebody into it. That's the easy way out, I think. As I say to students, how can you get some empowerment for yourself in terms of being able to teach this confidently and competently? The other issue around this as well is that all of the sudden students and, even academics will see this and well, I'm not actually engaging with Indigenous people or Indigenous students. How are you then actually teaching non-Indigenous students around this? How are you, transmitting credible knowledge to the next generation? Okay. So I guess I'm sort of getting people boxed in so you can't move. That you have to sort of engage with it. But I think if we're talking about this reconciliation agenda, that is something that you can actually do. How are you teaching well? How are you lecturing well in this space? How are you researching? How are you building the capacity just through your own sphere of influence? And I think that we think too big and, sort of get immobilised with it, that we don't know what to do, etc., etc. I think the very small, how do you eat an elephant, sort of one leg at a time or a toe at a time. Little steps, I think. We're very patient people. These things will change. It takes time. And I think particularly at the university level, and this is one of the things where we fail Indigenous students, Indigenous academics, is we're always reactive to the problem. We never actually plan. It's like, okay, I'm going to go on a recruitment drive and I'm going to get, all of these academics and I'm going to put them into a faculty or school. Yet the faculty or school has no idea on what being culturally safe is. We're starting to talk about cultural competency at the Universities of Australia level, but cultural competency is something that you can measure, and I'm a bit sceptical in terms of the cultural competency, because one of the funny things is that we don't have those critical conversations around race in Australia. I don't understand why we can't do that. Why does somebody, just get automatically, immobilised if someone says whiteness, or if somebody says, own your privilege, or if somebody says, I don't understand it. It seems to be one of those relationships where everyone else can say to us that we need to fit in, yet nobody else will actually think about what can I do, or what do I know as a non-Indigenous person? I think it's those sorts of things, and you can't actually get to the end of it unless you can have these open, frank conversations. I think that is how you have a culturally safe workplace, research environment, okay? To actually, to give a student a bit of theory wrapped around why are they actually feeling bad when you're talking to them? Why do they feel uncomfortable And they suddenly go, well, it wasn't me, it was my ancestors, etc., etc. All of those conversations. It's like, well, this is what imperialism is. And this is what, race privilege is, as such. And I think you see it in learners, like once they actually can contextualise something like that, the depth of learning and the engagement is phenomenal. So, some of the ways in terms of how you can engage with this as a non-Indigenous person within your sphere of influence. Something we've sort of tagged an Indigenous perspective. So have empathy for Indigenous matters revolving around acceptance that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are equal. I know that some of these look blatantly obvious, but, we have to have these conversations, and you can probably ask, Indigenous colleagues, these are conversations that we're actually still having. Okay? Should thus be treated equally, that is, Indigenous people should have the access to and outcomes from education as non-Indigenous people do. Okay? In terms of the undergraduate level, students who are of Indigenous backgrounds have the right to be in class and not be spoken about and invisible. I think many universities at the moment are looking at how they're indigenising curriculum, and I think this is one of the key aspects. I mean, I have cases of students at my own institution who refuse to go to classes because they're spoken about like they're not there. And they also don't look Indigenous, which is the big thing as well. Okay. I think also passionate and profound commitment that has changed, and this is you as an individual, like there must be a light bulb moment that has changed every corner of their lives, containing a radical questioning of the traditional, colonial, civil service administrative mindset of the ways in which these privileged settlers' ways of being and knowing. Okay? Question the administrative, structures. The one way to, control Aboriginal people within an organisation is to administer them in terms of a colonial administrative practice, constantly under surveillance, etc. Okay. And I think to actually this is a really important thing, is to understand that Indigenous people suffer inequalities and injustices in society, while non-Indigenous settlers, particularly those in the administrative and governing classes, receive various forms of power and privilege. Okay? This is a fact. If we're looking to build staff and things like that, it's something we have to actually deal with. That's why I come back to having those critical conversations and be comfortable with it. I know many of my colleagues who are Indigenous, we're not sort of banging on all the time that, you should be feeling guilty. It's just like, okay, accept it, and now let's sort of have a conversation of how we're going to get, past this. And I think that's how you have the conversations. And a recognition that the current dominant model of education fails to recognise the rights of Indigenous peoples and is therefore oppressive to Indigenous children, as well as being limiting for non-Indigenous children. I think sometimes when children engage in this space, Aboriginal children, is that suddenly the teacher thinks that they're not cultured. You know what I mean? They're little beings that have a culture, and that you come to school and you're sort of like filling them with content as such. It's about the recognition, okay, that there's two cultures at play here. One of the things as an Indigenous parent that you're teaching children at very young ages, that it's just subconscious, is teaching about resilience around racism at the kindergarten level. You know, having these conversations with young children even before they go to school, giving them coping strategies for that. I don't think it's, I always lose my sort of, and shake my head around that. And, at the early childhood and primary level, that when you're looking at the resilience of Aboriginal children in terms of this space, giving them coping mechanisms, telling them what to say if somebody says something to you in the classroom, telling them what to say if the teacher says something, who to talk to. I mean, it's still happening as such. So what some of the ways, and I'm just going to flick through these fairly quickly for you. In terms of institutions and institutional change, many institutions have reconciliation action plans. If you're in a school or faculty, see if there's some actions that possibly may sit with your area at the university level. And one of the things around reconciliation action plans, I've actually got a PhD student studying these, is that in her data she's found that the reconciliation action plan actually sits organisationally with the Indigenous unit. So that's, I think one of the easy things is to sort of elevate it and put it somewhere else. And, as I said again, it's all, if you have the Indigenous staff coming out doing this, you're always the angry guy with the rap. You haven't done this. You haven't done this delivery. That's really not reconciliation. It's a bit of resentment. And I think here is actually affirming the sui generis rights of Indigenous peoples, which is in intellectual property law. These are the inalienable rights that you cannot take away from somebody. Okay? They cannot be extinguished. I think it's sort of, and that's where I come back to, and I think about this is my genetic right here, and it's framed, and this is my knowledge and culture as such. And Terry Jenke's done a lot of work around this in terms of teasing this space out and how are we engaging, with this at that legal level. Things as simple as recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contributions to Australian society. As I said, how do you know what you know and where did you learn it? 9 times out of 10 it's the media. So how are we reflecting sort of some of the positive stories, I guess, into this narrative of change? Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership. Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in education as well. As I said, there's only 360 academics nationally. If we break that down again in terms of Indigenous scholars in education, that's a different sort of, a fairly recognisable sort of group. And as I said earlier, I can only speak as one person, but constantly we get people wheeled out to speak about different initiatives in the Indigenous realm. You're Indigenous, so you can talk about this. There is no way I would talk about the sort of in-depth in a forum around the treaty sort of that sort of conversation, because I don't know enough. I'm not a lawyer, and I have had this argument with people who are not educators, then informing on educational practices. So if we look at a lot of the governmental advisors in this space, well, they're actually lawyers and anthropologists, not educators. So I think just those things can create lots of change. Education leaders. Thank you.